The bride arrived in the town with a wedding dress in her arms and a bundle of love letters in her bag, but the groom swore he'd never written a single word. The townsfolk whispered. The girl stood still in the rain, humiliated, heartbroken. And yet, the one man nobody noticed was hiding a secret that could change everything. A vow written in another man's name, a love born from a lie, and a long overdue debt that would end up saving 3 lives. So pull up a chair by the fire, pour yourself a warm cup of coffee, and let me tell you a story, one where by the time the truth comes out, no one is quite the same again. The rain came down without warning, sharp and cold, as pins against the dusty main street of Silvervale. A low rumble of thunder rolled over the hills, and the August sky darkened to a shade that stole the light from the storefront windows. By the time the stagecoach pulled in, hooves splashing through new-formed puddles, the townsfolk had already begun to gather on porches and behind half-drawn curtains, eyes squinting through the downpour. Vera Avery, owner of the Golden Lantern Saloon, leaned out beneath her striped awning, arms folded across her chest, one eyebrow arched in amused suspicion, as she watched the commotion gather. "That the noon coach from Junction?" she asked no one in particular. "Looks like it," drawled Hank Morgan, the old blacksmith, wiping his hands on a rag. "Poor soul inside. Picked the wrong day to come callin'." The coach groaned to a stop in front of the depot. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped down. A young woman, soaked through to the skin, clutched a bundle wrapped in oilskin, a wedding dress, though no one could see it yet. Her boots hit the mud, and she flinched as if the earth itself had betrayed her, as if even the ground had conspired to mock her faith in a promise that never existed. Her hair, once carefully pinned, had loosened in the rain. Red-rimmed eyes scanned the street, searching for a face. Any face. The bundle slipped slightly in her grip as she stepped forward. One hand trembled, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. From across the street, someone muttered, "Ain't today Brooks's wedding day?" Another voice, hushed but insistent, "That her the bride." And then a louder one, laced with amusement, "Lord have mercy, she looks like she just came from a funeral." Maggie Rowan heard it all, though she wished she hadn't. Her heart thudded painfully, not from exertion, but from the humiliation that settled heavier than the rain on her shoulders. She stood in the middle of the street, her travel dress soaked through, her gloves ruined, and her pride bleeding out with every heartbeat. The depot door opened, and a man stepped out. Calder Brooks was taller than she expected. Broad through the shoulders, his frame filled the doorway, like a man used to silence and safeties. He wore a weathered oilskin coat and a hat pulled low against the rain, shadowing his face. But even then, Maggie could see the contagion in his eyes. Their eyes met. Her lips trembled. "Mr. Brooks." He took a slow step forward. "Ma'am." She swallowed. Her throat burned. With trembling hands, she reached into her satchel and withdrew the packet of letters, folded neatly, corners softened by rereading. Rain spotted the parchment as she held them out to him. "You wrote these. You said you wanted a wife, that you'd marry me." Calder stared at the letters as if she'd handed him a live snake. He did not reach for them. "I don't know what this is," he said quietly, but the words carried. The crowd shifted, hungry for spectacle. You said your name was Calder Brooks, that you had a ranch outside Silvervale, that you wanted someone strong, practical, honest. You said, I never wrote to you." The words hit her harder than the thunderclap that followed. Maggie's breath caught, and for a moment, the world tipped sideways. She looked at the letters again, desperate for some flaw in her memory, some explanation that didn't end with her standing alone in the mud. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Men shifted on their heels, women clutched shawls tighter around their shoulders, and a hush of murmurs passed like wind through wheat, growing louder with every second of stunned silence. A woman whispered, "Poor girl's delusional." A man near the post office spit it into the mud. Either she's a liar, or he is. Maggie's knees buckled, and she dropped to one knee, the oilskin bundle pressed to her chest like a shield. Her tears mingled with the rain. She'd left everything, her town, her job, what little reputation she had left for this. And now it was unraveling before strangers' eyes. She didn't see Calder move, but suddenly he was beside her. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat as he opened his coat and shrugged it from his shoulders. "Miss Rowan," he said, voice quiet but unwirring. She didn't look up. "I don't know who sent those letters," he continued, kneeling to her level, holding the coat open. "But if you came all this way in good faith, then I suppose you've been left at the altar by a man you never met. And for that," he draped the coat over her shoulders, "you don't have to pretend with me." The rain softened as if in respect. The townsfolk watched, stunned into silence. Somewhere a wind chime clinked faintly on a porch, and Maggie, heartbroken and humiliated, felt the first flicker of something else beneath the grief. Not hope, not yet. Too much shame clung to her. Too much disbelief clouded her thoughts. Trust had been broken before it ever had the chance to grow. As Calder stood casting a look around at the gawking crowd, he motioned toward his horse hitched nearby. "There's a place not far where you can dry off. I reckon you don't want to be seen shivering in the street much longer." Maggie hesitated, every bone in her body aching with resistance, but the weight of her situation left little choice. She nodded once barely. As they walked away, the townsfolk murmured louder, some shaking their heads, others whispering about the scandal surely brewing. Vera Avery watched them go, with a knowing squint, tapping her finger thoughtfully against her lips. Behind them, the stagecoach driver tipped his hat, to no one in particular, and climbed back aboard. Rain still fell, but softer now, like the town itself was holding its breath. If old stories make your heart slow down for just a beat, then go ahead and hit subscribe. Every subscription is a companion on the trail, a quiet reminder that honest things still deserve to be heard. The road out to Calder's ranch was slick with mud, the wheels of the buckboard groaning with every turn. Maggie sat beside him in silence, Calder's coat still wrapped around her shoulders. The hem of her dress was caked in wet earth, and the bundle with her wedding gown sat on her lap, like a ghost she didn't know how to banish. Neither of them spoke for nearly half the ride. Calder kept his eyes on the trail ahead, hands steady on the reins, jaw set with something unreadable. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Maggie finally said, her voice nearly lost in the drizzle. Calder's reply was slow in coming. "You didn't," he said, his voice low-edged with something between suspicion and reluctant concern. "Someone else did, and I aim to find out who and why." The ranch came into view as the fog lifted, a modest homestead, nestled in a cradle of hills, fences stretching wide like open arms. There was a tiredness to the place, but also something worth enduring. Maggie couldn't help but feel it mirrored the man beside her. He helped her down without a word, led her inside. The house was simple but clean, with a stone hearth, a woven rug, and the smell of pine soap and smoke. Calder motioned to the small guest room at the end of the hall. "You can stay here, just until we sort things out." She nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "You can call me Calder." News traveled fast in Silvervale. By sunset, half the town knew Calder Brooks had taken in a mail-order bride, who may or may not have been duped. Pearl Avery stood behind the bar of the Golden Lantern, polishing a glass she'd already cleaned twice, her jaw clenched tighter with each pass. The glass wasn't dirty, hadn't been all day, but scrubbing gave her hands something to do, while her mind churned with a cocktail of bitterness, jealousy, and old aching wounds she hadn't wanted to revisit. Her gaze was fixed on the swinging doors, like they might deliver the truth if she stared hard enough. "She's staying with him?" she asked, not bothering to hide the edge in her voice. "That's what Mabel says," Moved right into the guest room, like she owns the place, replied Ruthie from the boarding house. Pearl's mouth twitched. Girl shows up in the rain with a sob story, and now she's playing house. Maybe it's real. Maybe Calder really did write those letters. Pearl laughed sharp, bitter. That man's barely said 10 words in a row since the war. You really think he penned 6 months' worth of love notes? At the mayor's office, Calder leaned against the doorframe, hat in hand. Those letters came through your post, Wexler. You recognize the handwriting. Mayor Wexler, a heavy-set man with a slow drawl and eyes too tired for their age, shook his head. Mails handled by the clerk mostly. I don't look at return addresses. Calder's eyes narrowed. But you know something. Wexler hesitated. Only that the letters were postmarked here, not forged from some far-off place. Whoever sent them did it from right under our noses. Sunday morning, the church bell rang across Silvervale. Maggie, unable to sleep through the stares and whispers, found herself drawn to the sanctuary. She sat in the back pew, clutching the worn hymn book, like a lifeline. The scent of old wood and wax polish wrapped around her. Only after several minutes did she notice she wasn't alone. A man sat 3 rows behind, up in shadow. Ragged coat hands, calloused beard untrimmed. One boot tapped a slow, restless rhythm against the wooden floorboards, and he carried the mud, earthy scent of tobacco and rain-wet soil details that made him seem both out of place and curiously grounded. He looked more like a drifter than a parishioner. His eyes were fixed on her, not rudely, but with an intensity that sent a chill up her spine. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away. Later, Calder approached Wexler outside the church. That drifter's been hanging around since before winter, Calder said, squinting slightly. Doesn't talk much, just watches. Sometimes he seems familiar, but I can't place from where. Wexler shrugged. Calls himself Henry Doyle. Keeps to himself. Sleeps behind the chapel most nights. That afternoon, Maggie walked to the general store. Her plan was simple: buy thread to mend her gloves and avoid anyone who looked like they might ask questions. Near the stall of apples, her coin purse slipped from her hand. Coins scattered across the wood floor. She gasped and dropped to her knees. A hand reached out to help. She looked up. It was the man from church. Thank you, she said, voice small. He nodded. Ma'am. Their hands brushed briefly. His fingers were rough, but his touch was gentle. For a fleeting second, his eyes locked onto hers. There was something haunted there, something unresolved. Then he stood and walked away, without another word. Maggie watched him disappear into the alley behind the store. That night, over a supper of biscuits and stew, Maggie laid the letters out across the kitchen table. Calder sat across from her, eyes scanning the inked pages. This one, Maggie said, pointing to a paragraph, mentions a memory. I remember you laughing under the apple tree by the southern ridge, your hair full of blossoms, saying you'd never leave this place. I thought it was poetic. But, Calder's brow furrowed. But what? That tree, it's real, isn't it? He leaned back slowly, the air shifting around him. There's only one apple tree like that near here, and only one person who's ever heard me talk about it. Maggie waited. Henry Doyle. The name hung between them like a secret unspoken. Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere in town, a bell tolled the hour. And inside the Brooks ranch house, something old and buried had begun to stir. The morning sun cast a long fingers across the ranch land, painting golden strokes on the dew-drenched grass. Calder stood near the corral, a lasso coiled loosely in one hand, glancing toward the barn where Maggie had disappeared to fetch feed. He hadn't planned to bring her along. He hadn't planned for any of this, but there was something about her presence, quiet and steady, that made the silence less sharp. Go on, he muttered to his mare, as she sidestepped anxiously. She's not gonna bite. Maggie emerged with the grain sack over her shoulder, face flushed from the effort. Calder moved forward on instinct. "I've got it," she said quickly. "I know." He didn't stop moving, taking the other end to ease her burden. Their hands brushed again, and for a moment, they both paused. Maggie's breath hitched, Calder's fingers twitched, and a flicker of something unspoken passed between them, hesitant, electric, and far too dangerous to name. There was a current between them, unspoken, unsure. Work filled the next few hours, mucking stalls, checking the fences, and tending to an injured bay gelding with a swollen knee. Maggie knelt in the straw, carefully applying the poultice Calder had mixed. "You've done this before," he said, crouching beside her. "My father bred mules," she replied. "I learned young. Animals don't lie to you." Calder grunted in agreement. His eyes lingered on her hands, capable, gentle. He found himself watching her more than he should have. There was grace in the way she moved, a softness that had nothing to do with weakness. By dusk, they sat on the porch steps, sipping warm coffee. The day had worn them both out, but in that quiet lull between light and dark, something tender settled in the air. "You're not what I expected," Calder said suddenly. Maggie raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect?" "I don't know. Not someone who works harder than I do." She smiled faintly. "I didn't expect a man who still says ma'am, even when he's mad." He chuckled, surprising both of them. That night, Calder rose from a restless sleep. The wind had picked up, and the old house creaked like it remembered things it didn't want to. He padded down the hallway barefoot, drawn by a flicker of light beneath the guest room door. He knocked lightly. "Maggie." No response. He pushed the door open a crack. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, her wedding dress in her lap. Moonlight from the window bathed the room in blue-gray shadows, casting delicate beams across the creaking floorboards and catching the soft rustle of satin in her lap. She didn't look up, but he saw the shimmer on her cheeks. "I thought maybe, if I wore it again, I could pretend it still meant something." Her voice cracked. Calder didn't speak. He crossed the room and sat beside her, his presence nice but steady. "You don't have to explain," he said. "I know it's foolish. I know it's just heartbreak. But it's yours. You came here on a promise." She turned to him. "A false one." He didn't deny it. Instead, he gently took the dress from her hands, folded it with surprising care, and set it aside. "Someone used my name to make you believe. I don't know why. But I do too know what it feels like to want something real and be handed a lie." Her breath caught. "Do you think someone who knows you could have written those letters better than you ever could?" Calder looked away, jaw tightening. "There's only one man alive who might have known me like that. And he stopped being part of my life after the war." Flashback. Smoke thick in the air. Screams in the distance. Calder, younger, bloodied and limping, lifted a wooden beam off a collapsed tent. Beneath it, a boy no older than 17, trembling, weeping. "Mama, Mama." Calder dropped to his knees. "You're all right, soldier. You hear me. You hold on." The boy looked at him through swollen eyes, clutching Calder's sleeve like it was the last thing tethering him to life. "You got a name?" The boy nodded weakly. "Henry." In Silvervale at the Golden Lantern, Pearl Avery was tired of wondering. That woman Maggie was too quiet, too composed. Something didn't sit right. Late into the evening, when no one was watching, Pearl slipped into the post office's back room, where old mail bins were kept. She had worked there as a temp, once knew the drawer where misfiled letters sometimes ended up. There, buried beneath receipts and forgotten parcels, she found them. The first batch of letters those Maggie had shown Calder. But the return address wasn't a ranch. It wasn't even a person. Pearl stared at the paper, her pulse quickening. A chill prickled at the base of her neck, as suspicion twisted in her gut. Was this it? The proof she didn't know she was looking for, but somehow expected to find. Her fingers tightened around the envelope, breath caught between dread and dark satisfaction. It was the church. Her heart thudded. The next morning, Calder rode into town. The tension between him and Maggie had shifted warmer, yes, but more uncertain. She'd touched something in him last night. He wasn't sure what to do with it. He found Father Mallory sweeping the chapel steps, the broom rasping softly against the worn stone, the air thick with the faint scent of old wood and candle wax. "I need to ask you something straight," Calder said. "Did you send those letters?" The priest blinked. "Letters to Maggie Rowan, with my name on them." Mallory set the broom down slowly. "No, Calder. I never sent a single letter. But what? There was a mate. Came by last fall. Said he needed a return address. Claimed he was trying to reconnect with someone. Polite enough. Seemed lost." Calder's stomach dropped. Name Henry Doyle. Back at the ranch, Maggie tended to the injured gelding again. She hummed softly, unaware of the storm brewing in Calder's chest as he rode back. He didn't know what it meant, yet why Henry had done it, what he wanted, what part of Calder he thought he still knew. But the truth was peeling itself open one layer at a time. And underneath it all, something real was forming between Calder and the woman who'd believed in a lie, and might just be the only one telling the truth. The sun had barely crested the hills when Calder found Henry Doyle by the creek, kneeling beside the rocks with his sleeves rolled up and a tattered hat shading his eyes. Morning mist curled low to the ground, and a heron lifted from the reeds as Calder approached. Henry didn't turn. "Thought you'd come." His voice was as worn as his coat. Calder stepped closer, boots crunching on the gravel. "You've been writing those letters," Calder said, his voice tight with something between disbelief and fury, a muscle twitching in his jaw. It wasn't just accusation, it was betrayal, conversion, and something deeper he didn't want to name. It wasn't a question. Henry stood slowly, brushing his hands on his trousers. The lines on his face seemed deeper in the morning light, and his eyes, pale, stormy, met Calder's with neither fear nor apology. "I did." Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn wire. "I could ask why," Calder said, voice low, controlled. "But I think I already know." Henry nodded. "Some debts aren't easy to repay, especially when you're not sure you deserve the second chance." Calder stared at the creek, the water catching gold like scattered coins. "Why my name?" "Because she wouldn't have answered a drifter. But a man like you, she might believe in him. She might bring something back into your life that war took. You lied. I gave her truth through your name. My words were clumsy maybe, but honest." Calder didn't answer. He turned and walked back up the rise toward the barn where Maggie had begun her morning chores, unaware that a war from long ago was still playing out. The next day, Henry packed his few belongings into a small sack. Maggie found him behind the stables, cinching the flap closed. "You're leaving?" she asked. "I've done enough harm." He didn't meet her eyes. "But you meant well. Sometimes that ain't enough." She stepped forward. "Calder doesn't hate you." Henry smiled sadly. "No, but he doesn't need me stirring up more ghosts." A noise behind them cut the air, fast footsteps, then a shout. Before Henry could turn, a figure lunged from the side, dusty coat hat pulled low. A fist crashed into Henry's ribs, sending him staggering back. "Stay away from her, you lying bastard." It was Elijah Brandt, Maggie's old suitor, who'd followed her trail west. Jealous, bitter, and now violent. Calder arrived just as Elijah raised a knife. He tackled the man to the ground. They rolled through the dirt, exchanging blows until townsfolk rushed in, pulling them apart. Henry lay gasping, blood soaking through his shirt, each breath ragged and shallow. Pain etched deep lines into his face as his fingers grasped blindly at the dirt. Maggie clutched his hand tightly, her voice trembling as she whispered his name, but his eyes fluttered with confusion, his body shivering, despite the sun beating down. The warmth of her touch, seemed to anchor him to the moment, even as the world around him blurred at the edges. Maggie dropped beside him. "We need a doctor now." Pearl ran for help. Wexler knelt beside them, murmuring a prayer. Henry's eyes fluttered. "Tell her," he rasped, staring past Maggie to Calder. "I just wanted someone good for him. Someone who could see past the dust and silence." Calder clenched his jaw, holding Henry's hand. "You saved my life back then," Captain Henry whispered. "I was nothing, just a boy in mud and blood. You dragged me out when no one else would. Years later, I saw you again. Through the window of that little mercantile. You looked so lost. Like the war never really let go of you. I wanted to give you something back. I saw her photo in the back of that newspaper, a woman looking for a husband. She looked like hope, like something you'd never write to yourself but might need. So I wrote. I wrote because I couldn't say thank you. But I could try to fix what the war broke." Tears welled in Maggie's eyes. Calder bowed his head. Henry smiled faintly, and then he was still. The funeral was small, but heartfelt. A cool breeze drifted through the valley, stirring the wildflowers that lined the narrow path to the grave. The townsfolk stood in respectful silence, many with hats clutched to their chests, their faces solemn, touched by the quiet redemption of a man they barely knew. Pearl brought wild lilies, their scent subtle and earthy. Wexler's voice broke slightly during the eulogy, his words falling soft like ash in the hush that followed. Afterward, Calder stood by the grave long after everyone had left. The sky had turned the color of pewter clouds, gathering low on the horizon, as if mourning too. Maggie came up beside him, her hand slipping into his warm and sure. "He gave you more than you realize," she said, her voice steady against the wind. Calder nodded slowly, eyes on the stone. "He gave me you." Spring came early to Silvervale. The snow melted from the rooftops, and yellow wildflowers crept out from between the fence rails like she-children, testing the air. It had been 3 weeks since Henry's funeral. The town had returned to its rhythms, though something unspoken now lingered in the glances between neighbors, an awareness of quiet redemption and of wounds that could heal with time. Calder stayed. So did Maggie. But they did not marry. Not yet. She took up a room above the bookshop and began teaching at the small schoolhouse on the south end of town. Word had traveled fast that she knew Latin geography and could recite Whitman from memory. By the second week, even the surly twins from the logging camp sat up straight when she entered the room. It was slow work planting herself in a place where she'd once been seen as a joke, a mistake, a mystery. But Silvervale, as it turned out, had room for second chances. Pearl Avery stopped looking at her like a threat. Wexler invited her to Sunday dinners. Even old Mrs. Bramble, who'd once hissed harlot under her breath at the general store, now nodded in polite approval when Maggie passed. Calder would sometimes ride by the schoolhouse late in the afternoon, his horse tethered under the elm tree. From his saddle, he could hear the faint scratch of chalk on slate and catch glimpses of Maggie moving through bands of golden light that slanted across the floor. He watched as she erased the board with slow, thoughtful strokes, or leaned over a desk to offer a gentle word. He never interrupted, but he always waited for her to wave before riding off, a quiet admiration settling in his chest like a weight he didn't want to lose. Late in the afternoon, his horse tethered under the elm tree, watching through the open windows as Maggie erased chalkboards or gathered papers. He never interrupted, but he always waited for her to wave before riding off. He'd changed too. The townsfolk noticed. He smiled more, said thank you, and good morning. The shadows beneath his eyes hadn't vanished, but they no longer ruled his face. One morning, he returned to the old creek. The heron was gone now, but the rocks remained slick and half buried in thawing moss. He sat on a fallen log hat in hand and stared at the place where Henry once knelt. Calder cleared his throat. "I don't know if you can hear this," he murmured. But I want to say thank you." He didn't stay long, just long enough to kneel by the stream, place his hand wetly on one of the mossy stones, and bow his head. The air smelled faintly of thaw and pine, and for a moment the silence felt sacred. When he returned home, he found the letter on his porch. It was addressed to him in shaky handwriting, sealed with a scrap of ribbon that once tied Henry's pack. Calder opened it slowly. Inside, written in careful, painstaking script, was Henry's last message. "You told me once, Captain, that the war took your fire. I tried to give you back the spark. Maybe I overstepped, but I'd do it again if it meant you'd learn to smile." The words didn't burn. They warmed. That evening, Calder found a sheet of paper, dipped a pen in ink, and wrote. The next morning, he rode into town. Maggie was on the back porch of the bookshop folding linens. A warm breeze carried the scent of ink and baked bread from the street. Her hands paused when she saw the envelope on the table. No return address. Just her name in Calder's steady hand. She opened it. Inside, a single line. "This time the words are mine." She unfolded the letter. It wasn't long. Calder's writing was spare like him, measured, sincere. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make promise. He simply shared what he felt, how her presence had filled the silence Henry once tried to mend, how he had feared his heart was broken beyond repair, how she had proven him wrong. Maggie read the letter 3 times. Then she cried. Her thoughts swirled of Henry's quiet kindness, of Calder's restraint, of how every word in the letter felt like an anchor she didn't know she needed. The pain she carried cracked open not from sorrow, but from the gentleness of being seen. Not the broken tears from weeks ago, soaked in shame and rainwater. These were tears of clarity, of release. She looked out past the window and saw him. Calder was leading his horse slowly down the trail toward the edge of town. He hadn't knocked, hadn't waited. Maggie grabbed the letter, brushed her cheeks dry, and stepped onto the porch. Calder, he stopped, turned, and saw her standing there, sunlight behind her, the letter in hand, her eyes rimmed red. Calder removed his hat. Stepping closer, "You don't have to pretend with me," he said softly. "But if you choose to stay, I'd be the proudest man in Colorado." She said nothing. She just stepped down, crossed the porch, and paused in front of him. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for his hand. Calder looked at her, searching her eyes for a beat that stretched long and quiet. She smiled, small, certain, then rose on her toes and kissed him slow and sure, like the answer to a question long unspoken. Weeks later, the town gathered once more. This time it wasn't for mourning. The chapel was full of lilac and song, laughter spilling out onto the green fields beyond. Pearl baked her best cornbread. Wexler gave a speech that made even the Logger twins tear up. And somewhere, as the vows were spoken, a breeze swept through the chapel, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers, and something unseen, maybe gratitude. Maybe Henry Doyle's quiet smile, watching from where shadows touched stained glass. Maybe the echo of his last words about fire and spark, and finding joy again, lingering like incense in the rafters. Either way, the vow was real this time, and it was chosen. Perhaps somewhere within each of us, there's a silver veil, not a place on any map, but a destination for old wounds, unspoken gratitude, and the longing to be seen. The story of Calder, Maggie, and Henry isn't just a Western tale. It's an echo of what we carry deep inside: loneliness, a debt we never repaid, and the quiet hope that someone might look past our silence and still choose us. Henry wasn't a hero. He was a forgotten man who chose to say thank you by giving someone else a second chance. Maggie wasn't a fairy tale bride. She was a woman who stumbled under judgment, but stood tall again, choosing love with her mind and heart alike. And Calder is proof that sometimes what we need most isn't someone to save us, but someone to remind us that we are still worthy of love, and capable of giving it. If you've ever felt deceived or stood in a crowd feeling utterly alone like Maggie, or watched someone live the life you thought you'd lost, like Henry, know this: it's never too late to begin again. And perhaps without realizing, you are the light someone else never dared to kindle. Because a real vow is the one that's chosen, not forced. And sometimes to say, "I choose you," all we need is the courage to stop pretending.